Segment 25A, Introduction. On August 13, 1961, as a month-old baby boy snoozed contentedly in Racine, Wisconsin, that's me, the East German government started work on the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall eventually became 9 feet tall, covered with barbed wire, searchlights and guns, and guarded by dogs and elite policemen. It was not constructed to keep envious West Berliners out of the socialist paradise called East Germany. Rather, it was built to keep East Germans and other Soviet bloc inhabitants from trickling into West Berlin, and from West Berlin into freedom. West Berliners were isolated. The West was suitably outraged. President Kennedy himself appeared in Berlin and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." A Berliner, by the way, is Berlin slang for some kind of jelly roll donut. But in fact, the wall did communism more harm than it did good. More than any other thing, the wall symbolized the moral bankruptcy and outright tyranny prevailing in the Soviet Union and its client states. When the wall came down in 1989, it was a clear sign of the end for the USSR, which in fact survived the Berlin Wall by just 2 years. In segment 25B, Homo Sovieticus, we encountered the Homo Sovieticus, or New Soviet Man, which it was fondly believed communism would ultimately produce. In fact, years of depredation and propaganda and anti-intellectualism had made the Soviet populace even too apathetic to be cynical. Russian science, once the envy of all Europe, had been devoted to strictly military purposes for so long that the intelligentsia had basically gone into hibernation. That is to say, the lucky ones who avoided the Gulag and the psychiatric hospitals. In segment 25C, Gerontocracy, we trace the era of Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, a man whose bluff, pleasant personality disguised a tiny, alcohol-sodden brain. A perfect nonentity, he did what he could to let the Soviet Union slip down into a mass of apathetic despair. Brezhnev was not himself, as some believed, always old and senile. He was merely in his late 50s when Khrushchev was deposed in 1964. Brezhnev's handling of the Czechoslovakian Prague Spring of 1968 was vigorous, but eventually he came to exemplify the notion of gerontocracy, rule, and this is a definition, rule by extremely old men. Brezhnev was already likely senile when Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in December of '79. His aged successors, Andropov and Chernenko, were unable to get the troops out of Afghanistan or do anything to save the fast declining Soviet state. Segment 25D, Fall of the Soviet Empire, gives us the end of the USSR as we know it. It fell apart. The republics all ultimately seceded, using a right granted by them by none other than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin himself when the Soviet Union was founded. Isn't it ironic? In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev inherited a regime with a stagnant economy, massive and expensive military commitments, a corrupt, top-heavy bureaucracy, and a populace that no longer cared about anything. By introducing perestroika, or restructuring, to the economy, and glasnost, or openness, to political life, Gorbachev hoped to jolt the Soviet Union back on the path towards communism, and it didn't work. Segment 25B, Homo Sovieticus. As the Soviet state approached its 50th birthday in 1967, it could look with pride on some of its accomplishments. Soviet power had been firmly established everywhere in the old Russian Empire. A network of Eastern European client states buffered the USSR from the capitalist West. The military-industrial complex, built at such great cost by Stalin, had let the Soviet Union prevail in the Great Patriotic War against Germany. Even though Stalin had been forced to spout, temporarily, patriotic Russian rhetoric, eventual victory over Germany only reinforced the Soviet regime's prestige. After the war, Soviet technology caught up with American when the USSR produced a nuclear bomb in 1949. In 1957, the USSR even passed the United States in the space race by launching Sputnik, the world's first satellite. Around the world, undeveloped countries and revolutionary movements looked to the USSR for political and financial support. International capitalism had not yet been defeated, but it did appear to be retreating, especially in Eastern Asia, as Red China increased its influence. But on balance, time would show the USSR had failed more often than it had succeeded. Once, communist intellectuals had theorized about producing a new Soviet man, or Homo Sovieticus, a happy, hard-working soul bred and reared to serve as a cog in the Soviet state. Although the concept of Homo Sovieticus was pushed so hard that it was taught in all Soviet medical schools, it was a joke. Living standards in the cities remained poor, and in the countryside they remained wretched, even after Khrushchev and Brezhnev made consumer goods improvements. The proletarians appointed by Lenin to hold their dictatorship actually lived in cramped, miserable apartments and toiled long hours at ill-paid jobs. What dreams they still had were for things even poorer Westerners generally possessed: radios and refrigerators, and perhaps someday a cheap little car like the 1962 Moskvich. In general, Soviet city dwellers would have settled for stores stocked with good food, decent consumer goods, and no lines. The peasants were worse off yet. Forced by Stalin into huge collective farms run by the Communist Party, they were expected to feed the Soviet Union. If the crop failed, the Soviet Union would come in and take its cut first and let the peasants starve. Medical and cultural conditions were appalling likewise, and moving to the city was not only unlikely, it was illegal. Simply put, the Soviet Union's peasants had reverted to serfdom. From Peter the Great's time on, Russia had embraced Western culture. Before long, Russian poets, painters, and scientists were numbered among the world's greatest. Lenin and most of his cohort were the well-educated spawn of the middle and upper classes, effectively denied a place in public life by institutionalized czarist idiocy. Many of the intelligentsia had once cared deeply about the revolutionary movement. They believed that the Bolsheviks' commitment to education for all included all forms of education. And indeed, this is one area where communist deeds did back up communist words. Under the Soviets, the literacy rate skyrocketed, while thousands of people who would never have seen the inside of a lecture hall received a college education. What Soviet college students were allowed to learn, they learned very well. Yet overall, the Soviet culture, especially under Stalin, became an intellectual desert. True communists were men and women not of words, but of action. The Soviet Union's most promising students were invariably shuttled off into programs producing military hardware. Sometimes talented inventors were placed in special prison camps to make sure, of course, that they could just focus on their work. Meanwhile, socialist realism was the only recognized form of art. Mediocrity, or worse, reigned, as prizes were awarded to novels about cement, no kidding, or the nicest statue of Lenin. Anyone who spoke out against the Soviet state was removed from society, either executed, as under Stalin, or sent to a psychiatric hospital, as under Khrushchev and his successors. Ever resourceful, the Russian people managed to maintain somewhat its vivid intellectual life, but it had to be kept well hidden. Soviet science was further plagued by an outbreak of charlatans, claiming that communist science had actually transcended the laws of genetics. The laws of genetics ultimately won, but only after the scientific world of the Soviets was set back by a generation. Foreign technology was ridiculed. By the time Soviets came to appreciate Western advances in computer science, the West had gotten too far ahead to catch up with. For years and years, the Soviet people had been told that living conditions would improve drastically as communism came ever closer, maybe even by 1980. Lenin had said it, Stalin had said it, Khrushchev had said it, and now Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev was saying it. The Soviet people finally concluded that saying something over and over and over again did not necessarily make it true. The Communist Party had degenerated from a mass movement of people devoted to building a new society, by whatever means, into a club for bureaucrats and other weasels. The Romanovs and their noble friends had been kicked out and executed, only to be replaced by a new communist nobility, the nomenklatura, privileged offspring of men who had risen to power under Stalin. Was this what the Soviet people fought and died for by the millions during the Great Patriotic War? The so-called Homo Sovieticus, or Soviet man, turned out to be a grim, disaffected cynic who felt no loyalty at all to the Soviet state. There was little chance that the Soviet people would rise up against their masters. As is clear from Russian history, the people are used to strong, authoritative leadership from people like Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. Lenin and Stalin certainly fit this category too. Yet the structure of communism had become so rotten, very little would be required to make it fall in. Segment 25C, Gerontocracy. When Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev assumed power in 1964, the Soviet Union began to lurch into gerontocracy, the rule by very old men. Although Leonid was a fairly young 57 when he took power, the Soviet Union literally aged right along with him. Production of consumer goods continued, and more apartment houses were constructed. But an essential shoddiness continued to creep into everything Soviet. As we saw in the previous segment, the great majority of Soviet people had long since lost faith in communism, or even the leadership's ability to provide a useful and decent life. Party meetings would be called, a campaign would be started up, slogans would be shouted out, and then nothing. Nothing, that is, but more doom, despair, and agony. The Soviet Union's foreign policy during the Brezhnev era also shows a dreary pattern of decline. In January 1968, the leadership of the Czechoslovakian Communist Party reacted to an economic downturn by appointing a new party secretary, Alexander Dubček. That spring, Dubček won Czechoslovakian support with a reform program, including free speech, increased power for trade unions, and the right to ignore Soviet policies. The corrupt Czechoslovakian president resigned and was replaced by a Dubček supporter. Dubček pledged that Czechoslovakia would not leave the Warsaw Pact. But on August 21, 1968, Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia anyway. Dubček was carried off to Moscow. Soon he was announcing his support and gratitude for the Russian intervention. Needless to say, Dubček's reforms were also canceled. To justify this intervention, Leonid Brezhnev invented the Brezhnev Doctrine, which reserved for quote-unquote all socialist countries the right to intervene when or where a socialist country was being lured out of the Soviet bloc. Although the Western Bloc rightly protested the invasion of Czechoslovakia, there were strong parallels between the Brezhnev Doctrine and the Monroe Doctrine. There was only so much arguing the U.S. could do without looking hypocritical. Yet Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev's mental ossification also caused the USSR's biggest foreign policy blunder: the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. In 1904, Russia was faced with a war against Japan. Instead of working towards an agreement with Japan, certainly there was enough Asia for both imperial powers, Tsar Nicholas II listened to his advisors, who said a splendid little victorious war would bring Russia back into line behind him. What Nicholas II got was a double dose of dire disaster: a stunning defeat by Japan, followed by the Revolution of 1905. In December 1979, Russian history repeated itself. The Soviet Union got interested in Afghanistan for the usual Russian reasons. It was there. It was also directly south of the Soviet Union. The USSR did not want to see a fundamentalist Islamic regime seize power, as had just happened in Iran. Besides, the military-industrial complex was in the mood for another splendid little victorious war. Once Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, by then a very old 73, gave the go-ahead, Soviet troops seized the Afghan capital of Kabul and installed a puppet government. The Soviets eventually deployed 85,000 elite soldiers in Afghanistan, but they could not control the rugged countryside outside of Kabul. The Soviets also proved unable to train the Afghani army into a force which could stand on its own 2 feet. The Soviets were forced to settle for occupying Kabul and maintaining a bloody stalemate everywhere else. The USSR's splendid little war had turned into another Vietnam. The Soviet press tried hiding the war from the people. But by the time that the Soviet forces withdrew, over 1 million Soviet soldiers had ultimately served in Afghanistan. And as more came home dead, the word got out. To make matters worse, America, Saudi Arabia, and China all supported the anti-communist rebels, such as Mujahideen. Muslim fighters came from all around the world to join the Mujahideen's fight against the Russians, recruited by, among others, a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. Despite the USSR's vast technological and numerical superiority, their forces were stuck in a bloody quagmire with no real purpose for getting in and no real plan for getting out. Further, the Soviet government's lies about Afghanistan further corroded the morale of a people that had already given up on communism. Because of the Afghan War, the U.S. boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, which was supposed to present a new face of the USSR to the entire world. It didn't happen. Even though the Soviets returned the favor by boycotting the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, the Soviets clearly got the raw end of the deal. The Soviet Union was also starting to resemble a paper tiger. When the Polish Solidarity movement arose in 1980, the Soviets had to let the Polish Prime Minister handle the crisis his own way, because the Red Army was too heavily committed in Afghanistan. Even though the Red Army was 5 million men strong on paper, most of these men were recruits between the ages of 18 and 20, serving their mandatory 2 years. The hard core of the long-term army was busy getting shot up in Afghanistan. Absent any force to back it up, the Brezhnev Doctrine of 1968 was as dead as a doornail before it turned 15. 1 year later, on November 10, 1982, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev went to his eternal reward, succeeded by the 68-year-old KGB chief Yuri Andropov. Andropov, who had helped suppress the Hungarian Revolution back in 1956, had big ideas for saving the Soviet Union. But he was already in poor health, and he lasted only 16 months in office, dying on February 9, 1984. Andropov's successor, a 73-year-old Brezhnev crony named Konstantin Chernenko, lasted until March 10, 1985. By that time, it was clear even to the old coots on the Soviet Politburo that the Soviet gerontocracy desperately needed shaking up. And a drastic shake-up is what they got. Segment 25D, Fall of the Soviet Empire. On March 11, 1985, 54-year-old Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The youngest man in 50 years to take charge of the USSR, Gorbachev moved quickly to stabilize the Soviet state. One of Gorbachev's two major initiatives was perestroika, or restructuring of the long stagnant economy. His second initiative was glasnost, or openness in discussing and addressing political issues. But the entire communist system had been abused by corrupt bureaucrats for so long that mere legislation and mere public relations could not help. Gorbachev promoted a group of reformers who would support his initiatives, including the new communist boss of Moscow, a Siberian dude by the name of Boris Yeltsin. Some of Gorbachev's early efforts succeeded. For instance, he successfully extracted Soviet troops from Afghanistan in 1989. On the other hand, Gorbachev handled the Chernobyl nuclear disaster of 1986 in the time-honored Soviet way: denial followed by lies. As Gorbachev became more aware of just how shaky the USSR was, he introduced even more democratic reforms, including, in 1989, the Soviet Union's first quote-unquote free elections ever. Even though the elections were still rigged in favor of the communists, they also brought more serious reform politicians into power, regionally and nationally. Yeltsin, now estranged from Gorbachev, won himself a seat in the new Congress of People's Deputies and started playing his own game for power. Gorbachev's unwillingness to use military force hastened the disintegration of the Soviet Union. One of his spokesmen even joked about a Sinatra doctrine, in which the client states of the Iron Curtain could have whatever government they liked. They could do it their way. Hungary was the first client state to go its own way, followed by Czechoslovakia and Poland. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the former client states shed their communist regimes, demands for serious reform grew faster in the Soviet Union. At the same time, non-Russian minority groups throughout the USSR demanded independence, much as Stalin had foreseen nearly 70 years earlier. The Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, which had been forced into the Soviet Union as a result of Stalin's agreement with Germany, led the way out of the Soviet Union. Through 1990 and 1991, Gorbachev searched for a solution as his approval rates went into the tank. Gorbachev finally invented a so-called Union Treaty, which would somehow hold the USSR together in some way agreeable to everyone involved. While Gorbachev was on vacation in August 1991, a group of old-school military and KGB leaders staged a coup d'etat in Moscow, a revolution, if you will. While Gorbachev waited under house arrest, Boris Yeltsin, now president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, stood on a tank outside the Soviet White House and rallied the common people of Moscow to his side. The coup was unorganized, and it was unsupported by either the military or the people. It collapsed after 3 days. Gorbachev was freed from arrest, and he returned to Moscow. But his 15 minutes, so to speak, were up. He was still the official head of the Soviet state. But Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, enjoyed much more popular support, and therefore much more clout. Power was gravitating towards the individual republics and away from the Soviet Union. Gorbachev tried in vain to persuade Yeltsin and the other Soviet Republic presidents to keep the old Soviet infrastructure together. The Muslim republics of Central Asia, in particular, wanted to stay in the Soviet Union. The communists had forced these republics for decades to grow nothing but cotton, and these republics knew they were economically unprepared for independence. Even those republics which couldn't wait to get out of the Soviet Union were far less prepared for independence than they believed. However haplessly it was put together, however poorly it worked, the Soviet Union could not just vanish into thin air without serious consequences. Still, on December 8, 1991, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was officially replaced by the Commonwealth of Independent States. Ironically, the breakaway Soviet republics were exercising a right that Vladimir Lenin, of all people, had insisted upon when the Soviet Union was formed. On Christmas Day, 1991, the hammer and sickle flag was taken down from over the Kremlin and replaced with the Russian Federation's tricolor. The Soviet Union, once thought to be immortal, had lasted a mere 74 years. Although it was the product of two separate revolutions, and although it rejected everything about the Tsarist regime, it wound up being a different flavor of the same old tyranny. The General Secretary of the Communist Party replaced the Tsar. The Communist Party leadership, the nomenklatura, replaced the nobility. And the Communist Party itself replaced the Russian Orthodox Church. The only major difference was the Soviets' excessive cruelty. The Soviets executed, tortured, starved, relocated, and otherwise mistreated more people than even Ivan the Terrible could have imagined. It is sad indeed that the peoples of the Eastern European client states and the Baltic republics had to show the Russian people the way. But at least it happened. The sheer ineptitude of the Soviet leadership helped, no doubt, as did the Western countries' determination to hold the line against communist encroachment. Those brave people in communist countries who resisted against all odds, like the brave Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles, also contributed. But in the end, the Soviet Union crushed itself with its own ability to provide a better life for its people, with its rampant bureaucracy and corruption, with the ridiculous amounts of money it wasted on the arms race and on trying to promote world communism. For the number of genuinely positive achievements the Soviets could point to: space travel, literacy, defeat of the Germans in the Second World War or Great Patriotic War, its overall legacy is dismal indeed. And when in St. Petersburg, Russia, stop at the restaurant called Lenin's Mating Call. I highly recommend it. Segment 25E, Conclusions. 1. A funny and genuine Soviet anecdote. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev are all traveling together on a train. Unexpectedly, the train stops. Lenin says, "Let's declare an extra work day so the workers and peasants can fix this train together." The train stays put. Stalin dispatches his bodyguard to the engine, and a shot is heard. "So much for the engineer," says Stalin. "If the conductor doesn't get us moving, I'll shoot him too." Khrushchev then shouts, "Let's take the rails behind the train and use them to construct the tracks in front of the train." But the train still stays put. Finally, Brezhnev walks the length of the train car, pulling down all of the curtains, and announces, "Now we're moving, comrades." 2. Lies, lies, and more lies. The Soviet Union collapsed in part because its lies became so unbelievable that even the Soviet people couldn't buy into them. The nation which fought so heroically in the Great Patriotic War resented the lies told them about the war in Afghanistan. Unlike the lies which the Soviet Union told its people about the Americans, the Chinese, and the rest of the world, the lies about Afghanistan could be independently exposed. They could be exposed by the stories of soldiers who had come back from the war. They could be exposed by the families of soldiers who did not come home from the war. Gorbachev's ham-handed attempt to contain the damage at Chernobyl also showed him at his absolute Soviet worst. He turned out to be no better than his predecessors at admitting his own mistake. When presented with proof that he'd screwed up, Gorbachev just lied and made up something else. And this too caught up with him. 3. A prophet has no honor in his hometown. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev is admired and adored in the West as the man who oversaw the destruction of the Soviet Union. He is far less admired by his fellow Russians. One of my guides in Russia, an educated, well-mannered woman with no illusions about the Soviet Union, once gave me a lengthy impromptu lecture on how Gorbachev was the biggest idiot in all history. Say what you think. To the Russians, Gorbachev was responsible for the economic chaos of the late 1980s. And his bungling foreign policy, they believe, lost the network of East European states for which so many Russians had fought and died. At present, Gorbachev is not only alive, but also following international developments very closely. And to judge from what he's had to say about the world today in 2007, he isn't too happy with anybody. 4. The dominoes fall. One must not underestimate the role of the average man or woman in the street. Although the communists tried to remake human nature in their own image, I think that the human spirit proved too resilient. Perhaps none of the millions of acts of human resistance, great or small, in itself was enough to turn the tide. For example, although 40,000 Hungarians lost their lives in the 1956 revolution, freedom didn't come for another 33 years. When the Warsaw Pact forces invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, instead of fighting like the Hungarians had done, individual Czechs protested the occupation by dousing themselves in gasoline and setting themselves afire. The communist government of Poland declared martial law in 1981 to put the Solidarity movement out of business. But Solidarity leader Lech Wałęsa eventually wound up as the president of Democratic Poland. As I've mentioned earlier, the client states turned out to be the dominoes which wound up toppling the entire rotten edifice of the Soviet Union. Yet another possible downfall of empire.